Ethan Westbrook sat in his luxurious penthouse overlooking the skyline of Silicon Valley. The golden glow of the setting sun reflected off his polished desk, but his mind was far from at ease. He should have been celebrating the recent expansion of his tech company, but instead, unease gnawed at him, refusing to let go. For the past few months, Cole, his younger brother and the only family he had left, had become increasingly distant. What once was a strong, almost unbreakable bond between them now seemed strained. It was subtle at first, late-night calls that went unanswered, vague replies to messages, and a growing silence when they were in the same room. But lately, it had gotten worse. Cole's presence, which used to be a source of comfort, now felt like an obligation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark, neatly combed hair. He stared out the window at the sprawling city below, his thoughts swirling. Why was Cole pulling away? Was it something Ethan had done? Or worse, was his brother no longer interested in being part of his life? A faint sting of betrayal crossed his chest. He had always been the protector, the provider. And now, for the first time in their lives, Ethan didn't feel sure about their relationship. He had always trusted Cole implicitly, but lately, doubts began to creep in. Had Cole been using him? The thought seemed unthinkable. Yet there it was, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Ethan's gaze shifted to his phone, where several missed messages from Cole sat unread. His finger hovered over the screen, but his hand trembled slightly before he set the phone down. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something that Cole wasn't telling him. But what? What could be so important that his brother felt the need to hide it from him? A flash of frustration overtook him, followed by a rush of anger. Why couldn't Cole just be honest? Why couldn't they talk like they used to, openly, without any hidden agendas? That's when it hit him. What if this wasn't just about business? What if Cole had lost trust in him? The idea seemed ridiculous at first, but the more Ethan thought about it, the more it made sense. What if Cole wasn't the person Ethan thought he was? What if the bond they shared wasn't as strong as Ethan believed? Ethan's jaw clenched as he picked up the phone again, tapping in Cole's number. His heart raced, but before he could press call, something stopped him. A sudden thought. Could I be wrong about everything? What if the issue wasn't with Cole, but with me? What if I'm the one who's changed? The silence in the room pressed in on him, as if the world itself was holding its breath. What am I really afraid of? He wasn't sure anymore. He stared at the phone again, this time setting it back down with a newfound resolve. I have to know. I have to know if Cole is still my brother. A plan formed in Ethan's mind, a plan so drastic, so extreme, that it made his stomach churn. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. I'll test his loyalty. Ethan had the power, the means, and the resources to do whatever he wanted. If Cole had indeed changed, Ethan was ready to face the truth no matter how painful. It was a decision that would change everything. Cole sat at his desk, the papers in front of him a blur. His eyes flicked over the legal documents for the third time in an hour, but the words felt foreign, as though they weren't meant for him. He rubbed his eyes, willing himself to focus, but the frustration was eating away at him, gnawing at his insides like a constant, insidious hum. It wasn't the job. He was good at what he did. No, it wasn't the work. It was Ethan, his brother, the one person who should have understood him, who should have been there but wasn't. The distance between them had grown so wide that it was suffocating. The silence had become a weight he could no longer bear. Cole leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The resentment, the jealousy, it was all bubbling up inside him again. He had tried to bury it, tried to ignore it. But how could he? Ethan had everything: success, power, wealth. And Cole? He was good, but always in the shadows, never quite good enough. That was the problem. He'd never felt like he was enough. Not for Ethan, not for anyone. The phone on his desk buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Ethan. Cole hesitated. He hadn't heard from him in days, maybe longer. The silence had become so loud it made every call feel like a weight. With a deep breath, Cole answered. Hey, he said, trying to sound casual, though his voice felt tight. Hey Cole, how's it going? Ethan's voice came through, smooth and controlled, but underneath, there was something. Distance. "It's going fine," Cole replied, clenching his jaw. He didn't want to talk. He didn't know what he wanted to talk about, really. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Cole could almost feel Ethan thinking, hesitating, as though he were trying to figure out what to say next. But there was no warm familiarity in the silence, only an uncomfortable gap that stretched further by the second. "I've been thinking," Ethan's voice finally broke through the silence, "about everything. Us, I mean." Cole froze. His stomach churned. He felt the words in his gut before they even came out. "What do you mean?" Cole's voice was tight, strained, even to his own ears. Ethan sighed. "I don't know, man. Something's just off. Lately, it feels like you've been avoiding me. And I don't know why." His tone was measured, but there was an edge there, one that Cole hadn't heard before. Cole clenched his fists, feeling the tension build in his chest. He hadn't expected this. Not now, not like this. Avoiding him? He'd tried to be there, tried to carry his own weight, to avoid being the little brother that Ethan always seemed to carry around with him. But nothing ever felt good enough. Nothing ever felt like it made a difference. "Maybe I've just been busy," Cole muttered, swallowing hard. He knew it was a lie, but it felt like the only thing he could say. "You've been busy for months, Cole," Ethan replied, his voice softer now, but the underlying accusation was unmistakable. "Something's changed." The truth hit Cole like a slap. He wanted to scream, to say everything that had been festering inside him for years, but instead he stayed silent, his teeth clenched so tightly that his jaw hurt. Ethan had no idea. He had no idea how heavy it was to live in his shadow, no idea what it felt like to always be second, even when you gave everything you had. The silence stretched out between them, thick and suffocating. "I'm fine, Ethan," Cole finally said, his voice breaking the quiet. "Really, I'm tired, okay? I'm trying to figure things out." "Figuring things out? What does that even mean, Cole?" Ethan's voice edged with frustration now. "What's going on with you? Why won't you just talk to me?" Cole wanted to yell at him. "Because you don't understand, Ethan. You never have." But instead, he forced the words out, his voice trembling. "I don't need to talk, Ethan. I don't need your help, and I don't need your pity." Another silence, a long one. Then Ethan spoke, quieter than before. "I'm not offering pity, Cole. I just want to understand. I don't want to keep feeling like you're slipping away." The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. Cole's heart tightened in his chest, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He should have said something else, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all he could do was hang up the phone and stare at the blank wall in front of him. Alone. Again. Ethan stepped off the curb, blending into the bustling crowd of San Francisco's Tenderloin district. His once polished appearance was now hidden beneath the ragged clothes, dirt smudging his face and hands. The sleek, tailored suits he was known for, symbols of his success, were now a distant memory. He felt strangely small, inconspicuous, as if he no longer belonged to the world he once ruled. As he wandered through the unfamiliar streets, a gnawing discomfort spread in his chest. For the first time in years, Ethan Westbrook, the powerful CEO, was forced to face the harsh reality of life on the margins. It was a far cry from his penthouse view, the glass walls that once felt like a fortress of safety. Here on these streets, there was no protection, no escape. The cold air bit at his skin, making his stomach churn. He was hungry. Hunger, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He stopped in front of a street corner where a group of homeless individuals were gathered. Their eyes didn't meet his. They didn't see him. They were too focused on their own struggles, survival, the next meal, the next step. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. How did they live like this? How did they survive day in and day out, with nothing but the streets and the constant threat of being ignored, dismissed, or worse, hurt? He had always looked down on these people, seeing them as weak or lost. But now, he was one of them. A question loomed in his mind, one that he couldn't shake. What was he really afraid of? "Hey, man!" a voice called out, snapping Ethan from his thoughts. A man, older than him, with graying hair and a scruffy beard, was standing in front of him. His eyes were sharp, but they held no malice, only curiosity. "You need something?" Ethan hesitated. What was he supposed to say? What did he even need? The old man was offering him food, perhaps a place to stay for the night. But Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He could have easily dismissed the man, turned away, gone back to his life. But that wasn't why he was here. He was here to test, to understand everything. I need to understand," Ethan found himself saying before he could stop himself. The man nodded slowly, as if he'd heard this kind of confession before. "Life don't give you answers, son. You find them yourself." He shrugged and handed Ethan a half-eaten sandwich from his bag. "You're not the first one to ask." Ethan accepted the sandwich, the act feeling more surreal with each passing second. He was a millionaire, a man who could buy entire companies, and yet here he was, accepting scraps from a man he had once ignored. A strange mixture of shame and gratitude swirled inside him. As the man walked away, Ethan felt the weight of the decision he had made. This was more than just a test of loyalty. This was about understanding, empathy, and facing the ugly truths about himself. He had spent his entire life building walls around his emotions, convinced that success was the only thing that mattered. But now, as he stood on the street surrounded by people who had no choice but to face their own demons daily, he realized that his world, his carefully constructed empire, was nothing more than a fragile illusion. Ethan continued walking, the weight of his thoughts pressing harder with each step. He passed by people, some sleeping on the sidewalks, others huddled in groups, sharing whatever little they had. The sight of it all felt like a punch to his gut. What would it take for me to truly understand? He couldn't shake the question. What would he have to do to see the world, not through the lens of wealth and power, but through the eyes of the people who lived in the shadows, who were invisible to the rest of society? He needed to know. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself standing in front of a shelter. Inside, the air smelled of damp clothes and worn-out mattresses, but there was warmth. Real warmth. It wasn't the luxury of his high-rise apartment, but it was human, raw. The sounds of people talking, sharing, living together in the face of hardship made him realize how deeply isolated he had been. Sophie, the woman he'd met earlier, had said it best. "You can't understand the world until you're part of it. You can't keep watching from the outside." Ethan's transformation had only just begun, but already, the first cracks in his perception of the world had started to show. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face the answers. Cole glanced at his phone once more, the screen lighting up with a message from Ethan. It had been 2 days since their last conversation, and still, there was no resolution, no closure. Ethan's words, "Something's changed," kept echoing in Cole's mind, pushing him further into his spiraling frustration. His heart felt heavy, his chest tight, and every time he looked at his phone, he resisted the urge to call him back. He knew he couldn't keep running away from it. But he wasn't ready to face the reality either. The tension between them had been growing for months. It was hard to ignore the fact that Ethan was changing, becoming someone Cole couldn't understand anymore. For the first time in his life, Cole felt smaller next to his brother. The constant comparison, the feeling that he was always just a little less. But now, something had shifted, something had broken. Cole didn't want to admit it, but he was scared. Scared of being rejected, scared of being pushed away. What if Ethan didn't need him anymore? Cole ran his fingers through his hair, trying to shake off the nagging thoughts, but they wouldn't leave. Instead of feeling empowered by the success he'd built for himself as a lawyer, he felt invisible next to his brother's towering presence. And the silence, it was suffocating. Then his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from Ethan. It was a notification from Victor. "You need to see this." Cole's finger hesitated over the screen, but curiosity won out. He clicked the message. A link appeared to a news article. The headline read, "Local homeless man's mysterious past exposed." He opened the article, reading the details quickly. It was about a man found on the streets of San Francisco, a homeless man who had become a subject of public interest due to a mysterious backstory. The article didn't say much, but something about the photograph of the man caught Cole's attention. It was Ethan. His heart skipped a beat. He blinked, staring at the image again. The figure in the photo was unmistakably Ethan, though he had changed beyond recognition. His face was unshaven, his clothes ragged, his expression unreadable. The article didn't identify him, but there was no doubt in Cole's mind. Ethan had been living on the streets. He had no idea why, but everything clicked. This was it. This was the test Ethan had been preparing, the plan he'd set in motion. Cole didn't need confirmation. The weight of everything he'd been feeling, the silence, the distance, the odd behavior, finally made sense. His hands were shaking as he scrolled through the rest of the article. It talked about a rich man's game and how this man had been seen conversing with various people on the streets. But the piece failed to mention his true identity. Cole's breath quickened. Why would Ethan do this? Why had he felt the need to go to these extremes? Victor's follow-up message came in. Are you going to let him get away with this? Cole stared at the screen, feeling the anger bubbling up inside him. He had always respected Ethan, looked up to him even, but now it felt like a game, a twisted test of loyalty that Cole had never agreed to. He felt betrayed, humiliated. How could Ethan do this to him? Didn't he trust him? Didn't they have a bond? In a rush of emotion, Cole dialed Ethan's number, but his finger hovered over the call button. What could he even say? He didn't know what to think anymore, let alone how to express it. A voice broke through the tension in his mind. Victor's. You need to confront him, right now. Cole closed his eyes for a moment. He knew Victor was right. He couldn't sit back and let Ethan continue to manipulate everything between them. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to let Ethan control this anymore. This was his first test, a test of Ethan's loyalty to him, not just to some abstract idea of family. Would Ethan take the easy road and continue testing him, or would he face the consequences of his actions? Without another thought, Cole pressed the dial button. As the phone rang, his heart raced. He was done waiting for Ethan to open up. It was his turn to demand the truth, and the silence on the other end when Ethan finally picked up was deafening. Cole could feel his pulse in his throat as he waited for Ethan to speak. The silence between them was suffocating, thick with unspoken words and emotions that neither of them knew how to voice. The last time they had spoken like this, things had felt so different, so much easier. Now the air was charged with something darker, something that felt like a storm was about to break. Ethan's voice finally crackled through the phone, but it wasn't the calm, collected tone Cole was used to. It was different, more strained, more defensive. Cole, Ethan began, his words slow, measured. What you saw, I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. Cole's hand tightened around the phone. You didn't mean for it to get out of hand? He repeated, his voice rising without meaning to. You've been living on the streets, Ethan. You've been testing me like some kind of game, and you don't think that's out of hand? Ethan was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that felt like a confession waiting to happen. When he finally spoke again, his words were edged with frustration. It's not a game, Cole. It never was. I needed to know if you were still here, if you still cared. The words hit Cole like a slap. He wasn't sure if he was angrier at Ethan for putting him through this or at himself for not seeing it sooner. Cared? Cole scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You think this is about me caring? This is about you thinking I'm some kind of test subject. Do you even know who I am anymore? What I've been going through? I've been carrying everything on my own, and you. He stopped himself, realizing the depth of his own pain. The words felt sharp now, like glass in his mouth. I don't need your tests, Ethan. I needed my brother. But instead, you've been pushing me away. Every step of the way, you've been pulling back, acting like I'm not good enough for you. Like I'm some kind of afterthought. Cole continued, his voice trembling. The anger was turning into something deeper, something that hurt worse than the frustration. Betrayal. I never meant to push you away. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. You have to understand, Cole. I've been lost. I thought testing your loyalty would make things clearer. but I see now that it only pushed you further. I didn't want to hurt you. Cole clenched his jaw, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to spill out. But it wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about the years of feeling like he was never enough. Like he was always second to Ethan's success, always second to his brother's perfect life. And now, he was being tested like some kind of experiment. You don't get it, do you? Cole's voice broke, his chest tightening. I've been living in your shadow my whole life. You have everything, and I've been stuck here trying to prove myself, trying to keep up, trying to be worthy of your love. But it's never been enough. Nothing ever is. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Cole wasn't sure if Ethan was even still there, but when Ethan spoke again, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than Cole had ever heard it. I never saw it like that, Ethan admitted quietly. I never realized that I was pushing you down, that I was making you feel small. I'm sorry, Cole. I never meant to do that. I wanted to be there for you, but I was too focused on everything else. The weight of Ethan's apology hung heavy between them. Cole wanted to feel relief, but all he felt was confusion, like the rug had been pulled out from under him. Ethan was apologizing, but was it too late? Was it enough? I've been through so much, Ethan, Cole said, his voice raw. I've had to carry all the weight of this family on my shoulders, and you've been testing me, thinking that would fix things, but it hasn't and it won't. Ethan was silent for a long time before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize how much I've hurt you. I've been so focused on proving things to myself that I forgot what really matters. You matter, Cole, more than anything. The words were almost too much for Cole to bear. He'd spent so long holding on to this anger, this resentment, that hearing Ethan finally acknowledge it was like a punch to the gut. I don't know if I can forgive you right now, Cole said, the words tasting bitter. But I need time. I need space. I understand, Ethan replied, his voice small, defeated. Take all the time you need. But just know this, I'll be here when you're ready. I want to make things right. The call ended, and for a moment Cole just stood there, staring at the screen in his hand. He wasn't sure where things would go from here, or if they could ever go back to how they were. But one thing was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. Cole sat in his office, the legal papers in front of him untouched. His mind kept drifting back to the phone call with Ethan. His brother's apology had been genuine, but something about it had left him unsettled. He hadn't expected the words that Ethan had said, hadn't anticipated the weight of his regret. But even now, as Cole tried to focus, his thoughts kept swirling back to the test, the one that Ethan had created, whether intentionally or not. The more Cole thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was Ethan really sorry? Or was this just another way for him to control everything? Cole's hand gripped the edge of his desk as frustration bubbled up inside him. He had spent years walking in his brother's shadow, trying to live up to expectations that weren't even his own. Now it seemed like Ethan was still trying to control the narrative. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they refused to leave. Ethan had left him out of so much, his life, his decisions. Why hadn't Ethan come to him for support? Why hadn't he trusted Cole to handle things without turning everything into a test? A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. Victor. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning Cole's face. You're thinking about it too much, Victor said, his voice calm but firm. I can't help it, Cole muttered, running his hands through his hair. This doesn't feel right. Ethan's been acting so distant, so cold. I don't even know who he is anymore. Victor leaned against the door frame, watching Cole closely. He's your brother, man. Maybe it's time you trust him again, or at least try to. Trust him? Cole snapped, standing up abruptly. How can I trust someone who's been testing me like this? Like I'm some kind of project? I've been dealing with my own shit for years, Victor, and now he expects me to just… What? Drop everything? Trust that he's got my back? It doesn't make sense. Victor took a deep breath. Look, I get it. You've always had to live up to Ethan's shadow. But you know what? That doesn't mean he's not hurting too. He's been trying to push your limits, sure, but he's also been trying to figure out what you really mean to him. Cole's jaw clenched. But why? Why does he have to go through all this to figure it out? Why couldn't he just talk to me? If he's sorry, if he really feels bad about what he did, then why didn't he come to me like a normal person? Victor shook his head. Because, Cole, sometimes people don't know how to reach out. Sometimes it's easier to push you away than to admit they've been wrong. And let's be honest, man, it's not like you've been the easiest person to get through to either. The words hit harder than Cole had expected. He was right. He had built walls too. He had kept his own frustrations, his own resentment buried deep, never letting anyone in, not even Ethan. He had been too afraid of being vulnerable, of being hurt. I don't know what to believe anymore, Cole admitted quietly, his voice almost breaking. I've spent so much time being angry at him, trying to prove myself, but now I'm not sure if I even know what I want from him. Victor's gaze softened. Maybe it's not about proving yourself. Maybe it's about letting go of all that anger, all that baggage. It's hard, but you've got to decide if you want to keep holding on to it or if you want to move forward. Cole nodded, feeling the weight of Victor's words settle in. Letting go. It sounded so simple, but it felt like the hardest thing in the world. But maybe, just maybe, it was time. Time to stop holding on to the hurt and the resentment. Time to trust again. Thanks, man, Cole muttered, finally sinking back into his chair. Victor gave him a small smile, pushing off the doorframe. No problem, just don't wait too long to talk to him. If you really want things to change, you've got to meet him halfway. As Victor left, Cole sat back in his chair, staring at the blank screen on his computer. His mind felt clouded, full of questions with no easy answers. But the thought of moving forward kept repeating itself, echoing in his mind. Could he let go of the past? Could he forgive Ethan, even when everything felt so complicated? The doubt still lingered, but somewhere deep down he knew he couldn't keep living in the past, not forever. Cole stood by the window, looking out over the city as dusk settled in, a strange sense of unease gnawing at him. He had spent the last few days wrestling with his feelings, anger, confusion, hurt. But tonight, it all came to a head. He couldn't avoid it anymore. Ethan's silence had only made things worse. They needed to talk, and the longer he waited, the more the distance between them seemed to grow. He grabbed his phone and stared at it for a moment, his thumb hovering over Ethan's number. The weight of the moment made it hard to breathe. His heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. What would he say? Could he even put into words how much he had been hurt by this, by everything Ethan had done? Finally, he pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then Ethan's voice broke through the silence. Cole? Ethan's voice was cautious, like he knew something was coming, like he was already bracing for impact. What's going on? I need to talk to you. Cole's voice was firmer than he felt. The words had been building inside him for days, and now they were spilling out. About everything. There was a long pause on the other end. Cole could practically hear Ethan taking a deep breath. I'm here, Ethan said quietly. What's on your mind? Cole's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the phone. He wanted to yell, to let everything out at once, but he forced himself to slow down. He had to be clear. He had to say everything that had been weighing on him. You don't get it, do you? Cole began, his voice rising with emotion. All these games, all these tests. It's not just about the business or whatever else you're trying to figure out. It's about me. You've been testing me like I'm some project you need to figure out. Do you even see me as your brother anymore? Or am I just a tool you can manipulate when it suits you? Ethan was silent for a moment, and Cole's heart raced. He hated the silence, the way it stretched out, thick with tension. I never meant to hurt you, Cole, Ethan finally replied, his voice tight, almost apologetic. I didn't realize how much I'd pushed you. I don't know how else to get through to you. Cole laughed bitterly, the sound almost foreign to his own ears. You think testing me is how you get through to me? You think making me doubt everything, even my loyalty, is how you show you care? Ethan sighed heavily. I thought if I did this, if I tested you, it would prove that you still cared, that you'd still be there. I didn't know how else to see it, Cole. He stopped himself. I was scared. Cole's chest tightened. The words hit harder than he expected. Scared? Ethan had been scared. It was almost too much to process. For years, Cole had been the one carrying the fear, the insecurity. He had lived in the shadow of Ethan's success, always feeling like the second choice, like he would never be enough. And now, to hear his brother confess that it was fear driving him all along, it made everything feel even more complicated. "You think I've never been scared?" Cole asked, his voice softening just slightly. "You think I've never had to prove myself? To everyone, including you? You've had it all, Ethan. And I've been trying to keep up, trying to make you proud, but you..." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "You've been testing me, making me feel like I'm not enough, like I'll never be enough." There was a long silence again, but this time, it didn't feel like an endless chasm. This silence felt different, more vulnerable, like both of them were finally seeing each other for the first time in a long while. "I didn't know," Ethan finally whispered. "I didn't know that's how you felt. I'm sorry, Cole. I've been so focused on myself and everything I thought I needed, I didn't see what it was doing to you." Cole took a shaky breath. The anger wasn't gone, but it was no longer the only thing that fueled him. This wasn't just about betrayal or resentment. This was about something deeper, something he wasn't sure how to fix. Could they fix it? "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," Cole admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you again, but I need time. I can't just forget what you've done. I can't just act like it didn't hurt." "I understand," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'll give you as much time as you need. But just know that I want to make things right, Cole. I don't want to keep hurting you. I want to be your brother again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unsure. It was a start. But how much of a start? Could it ever be enough? Cole didn't have the answer. Not yet. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's take it one step at a time." "I'm here whenever you're ready," Ethan replied, his voice full of a sincerity Cole hadn't heard in a long time. As Cole hung up, he stared at the phone for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The weight of their conversation sat heavy on his chest, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a sliver of hope. Maybe things could change. Maybe after everything, they could find their way back to each other. But only time would tell. Ethan sat across from Sophie in the small, dimly lit shelter. The steady hum of conversations and clinking of cups filled the background. But in this moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Sophie had been the first person to show him any real empathy since he'd stepped into this new life, one that was so far removed from the comfort of his previous existence. But now, as she sipped her coffee in silence, he could tell something was weighing heavily on her. He had learned a lot from Sophie in the short time they'd spent together. She had opened his eyes to the raw, untold truths of life on the streets. The harshness, the survival, the resilience. But today, her usual forthrightness seemed to be missing. Sophie wasn't saying much. Her eyes lost somewhere between the worn-out table and the empty cup in her hands. "Sophie," Ethan said, his voice soft, yet with an urgency that broke the silence between them. "What's going on? You've been quiet." Sophie didn't look up immediately, and when she did, her gaze was heavy with something Ethan couldn't quite read. Her eyes, normally sharp and filled with a quiet strength, seemed distant. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then sighed. "I'm not the person you think I am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words felt like a weight that pressed down on Ethan's chest. "I'm not following," Ethan replied, leaning in slightly. He had always trusted Sophie, admired her for her grit and survival instinct, but now something in her demeanor was unraveling a story he wasn't ready to hear. Sophie put down her cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "I told you about my brother before, how I got here, how we were close until things changed." Her voice faltered for a moment, and she steadied herself. "The truth is, I didn't just end up on the streets. I left him. I ran." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had assumed Sophie's story was like so many others he'd heard, a tale of being down on luck, pushed into homelessness by circumstances outside of her control. But this was different. "You ran?" Ethan asked, confusion seeping into his voice. He thought he understood her pain, but this revelation made it clear he hadn't even scratched the surface. Sophie nodded, her face pale under the dim light. "Yeah, I left him when he needed me the most. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live with what he was becoming." Her hands clenched into fists, and she looked down again, avoiding his gaze. "My brother. He was like you in a way, powerful, used his position to get what he wanted. But there was something inside him that just broke. He changed. I couldn't watch it anymore." Ethan felt a shiver run through him. He had always seen himself as someone who could handle everything, someone who had everything under control. But now, listening to Sophie, he realized how much he had been hiding behind that mask. Was he like her brother? Was he becoming like him? Was he? Ethan started, then stopped. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer, but his curiosity overtook him. "Was he like me?" Sophie finally met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," she said quietly. "In the beginning he was, but over time his decisions, the things he did, they were no longer about the family or the people around him. It became about power, about control, and in the end it destroyed him and me." Her words sank in, chilling him to the bone. Ethan's mind raced. Was this what he was becoming? Was he losing sight of what mattered? He had pushed Cole away, manipulated him without even realizing it, all in the name of loyalty, all because he was afraid of what might happen if he didn't test the strength of their bond. "Sophie, Ethan started, but words failed him. He had been so sure of everything, but now the doubts Sophie had planted were starting to root themselves deep inside him. Sophie's voice softened, her hand resting on his. "Ethan, I'm not saying you're doomed to repeat the mistakes of your past, but the longer you ignore what's happening with you and your brother, the further you're going to push him away. Don't let the fear of losing him turn you into someone you won't recognize." Ethan swallowed hard. He had come here to test Cole, to prove something to himself. But now, he was faced with a truth he hadn't wanted to confront. The test he had created wasn't about Cole's loyalty. It was about his own fears, his own insecurities. "I've been so focused on what I wanted to prove," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to Sophie. "I've forgotten what really matters." Sophie gave a small, understanding nod. "We all get lost sometimes, but it's not too late. You can still fix things with him, but you have to be honest, Ethan, with him and with yourself." As Sophie stood up to leave, Ethan felt the weight of her words press upon him. He had been testing Cole, but in the process he had been testing himself. And now he had to decide whether he could face the consequences of what he had done and whether he could rebuild the bond that had been broken. "Thank you, Sophie," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sincere. Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Take care of yourself, Ethan, and take care of him too, before it's too late." Cole sat in his office, the weight of the evening's events settling heavily on his shoulders. His phone lay on the desk in front of him, the screen dimmed from the lack of activity. He hadn't heard from Ethan in 2 days, and the silence was maddening. The conversation they'd had, the confrontation that had felt like a tipping point, had left him with more questions than answers. Ethan's apology had seemed sincere, but was it enough? Could they really go back to how things had been? He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. It wasn't just Ethan he was struggling with. It was everything. For the past few years, he had felt the weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him. Not just Ethan's, but their father's. The burden of keeping up the family's name, keeping everything running smoothly, had been on him for too long. But he hadn't been able to share any of it. Not with Ethan, not with anyone. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Cole said, barely looking up. Victor stepped into the room, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something more serious. "We need to talk." Cole's stomach tightened. The last time Victor looked at him like that, it had been over something important, something that had shaken him. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down," Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor did as asked, watching Cole carefully. "What's going on, man? You've been distant. I can see it. You're avoiding something." "I'm not avoiding anything," Cole snapped. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. He'd been avoiding a lot lately. Himself. The truth. Victor studied him for a moment, then spoke again, softer this time. "I know something's been bothering you. I've known you long enough to see it. You've been carrying a load that's too heavy to handle alone, and you're not being honest with yourself about it." Cole looked away, unable to meet his friend's gaze. He had always been the one to hold it all together, the one everyone leaned on. But tonight, in the quiet of his office, the truth pressed in on him. He couldn't keep hiding from it. Not anymore. "Cole," Victor's voice softened. "What's really going on?" Cole sighed deeply. It wasn't something he'd ever wanted to admit, let alone talk about. But the pressure was building, and he knew there was no running from it anymore. He ran his hands through his hair again, frustration building. "I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," Victor said, his voice calm but insistent. Cole swallowed hard. The secret he had buried for years, the one he had kept hidden from everyone, even Ethan, had always been his greatest fear. He had tried to ignore it, tried to bury it under work and responsibility, but it was always there, watching him, whispering in the back of his mind. "I've been keeping something from Ethan," Cole began, his voice low, his throat tight. "Something big, something that could change everything." Victor's eyes sharpened, his attention fully on Cole now. "What are you talking about?" Cole looked up at Victor, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've been helping our father. He's been in serious debt, more than he's ever told anyone. I've been covering for him, taking on his bills, trying to keep it all hidden from Ethan. I didn't want to burden him with it. I didn't want him to see me as weak. So I've been trying to fix it on my own." Victor's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. "You've been doing all that alone?" Cole nodded, guilt heavy in his chest. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't let Ethan know. Not when he's already dealing with his own stuff. The last thing I wanted was for him to think I couldn't handle it." Victor let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Cole, that's a lot. A hell of a lot for anyone to carry on their own. But this isn't something you can fix by yourself." "I know that," Cole said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want to be the failure everyone expected me to be." Victor reached across the table, placing a hand on Cole's shoulder. "You're not a failure, but you need to tell Ethan. You can't keep carrying this alone, especially if it's going to ruin your relationship with him." Cole closed his eyes, the weight of Victor's words sinking in. He had known it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. But even now, the thought of facing Ethan, of telling him the truth, terrified him. "I don't know if he'll forgive me," Cole whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Victor's expression softened. "You don't know until you try, but you owe it to yourself and to him to stop keeping this secret. You've been living in fear of what might happen, but you can't keep running from the truth forever." Cole nodded, the truth finally settling in. He had hidden so much from Ethan for so long, afraid of losing him. But now he realized that by keeping this secret, he was only pushing him further away. For the first time in years, Cole felt like he might finally be able to breathe. Ethan's fingers drummed against the polished wood of his desk, the soft rhythm an attempt to calm the rising tension in his chest. The phone call with Cole had lingered in his mind since it ended, heavy, uncertain. It wasn't just an apology or a promise anymore. It was the beginning of something that both terrified and exhilarated him. They were both standing on the edge now, and whatever happened next would determine the course of their relationship. He had to see Cole. He couldn't wait any longer. It wasn't just about making amends. It was about the truth, about tearing down the walls they had both built up. Ethan couldn't live with the distance between them any longer. He stood up and grabbed his coat, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He knew that the conversation that awaited them would be the hardest one of their lives. Would Cole forgive him? Would they ever find their way back to the brothers they used to be? The drive to Cole's apartment felt longer than usual, each mile stretching out in front of him like an unspoken question. He tried to focus on the road, but his thoughts kept drifting back to everything he had done wrong, to all the ways he had hurt his brother. How had it all come to this? When he finally pulled up outside Cole's building, he hesitated before getting out of the car. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his heart racing. But there was no turning back now. The elevator ride to Cole's floor felt like an eternity. As the doors slid open, Ethan saw Cole standing at the end of the hallway, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, pressing in on them from all sides. Ethan took a step forward, but Cole didn't move. "Cole," Ethan began, his voice low, filled with both regret and hope. "I'm here. I want to talk. I need you to hear me." Cole didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. But the tension between them was palpable, thick with years of unspoken words and unresolved anger. "You said you wanted time," Cole finally said, his voice cold, distant. "Well, I've had time, and I've thought about everything we've been through, everything you've done, and I'm still not sure if I can forgive you." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing Cole say it out loud, hearing the bitterness in his voice felt like a punch to the gut. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Ethan said, taking a tentative step closer. "I don't deserve that. But I want you to understand why I did what I did. I need to explain." Cole's eyes narrowed. "Explain? After everything? You think I don't understand? You've been pushing me away for months, Ethan, testing me like I'm some kind of experiment. Do you know how that feels? To have your own brother question your loyalty like that?" Ethan's heart sank. He hadn't realized how deeply he had hurt Cole, how much the distance between them had cut him. His brother's words were a harsh reminder of the pain he had caused. "I thought I was protecting you," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I tested you, if I could see if you'd still be there when I needed you, it would be enough. But I was wrong. I've been so afraid of losing you, I pushed you away instead." Cole's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "I don't need to be tested, Ethan. I needed you to trust me. I needed to know that no matter what, you'd be there for me. But instead, I've been walking around with this weight, wondering if you even care." Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I do care, Cole. More than you know. I've always cared. But I've been so focused on the wrong things. I've let fear control me, and in the process, I've hurt you. I'm sorry." The words felt strange coming from his lips, almost foreign. He had spent so long hiding behind his pride, behind his need for control, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly be there for someone, to be vulnerable, to trust. Cole's expression softened, but the anger didn't completely fade. "I've been carrying everything on my own for so long," Cole said, his voice quieter now. "Trying to keep the family together, trying to be what you needed, but you never saw that. You never saw how much I was struggling." Ethan's heart ached. He had been so caught up in his own fears, his own insecurities, that he hadn't seen his brother's pain. He had never asked Cole how he was doing, how he was coping. He had only assumed that everything was fine, that Cole could handle it all on his own. "I'm sorry, Cole," Ethan repeated, his voice breaking this time. "I should have been there. I should have been a better brother." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had said hung between them, but this time, it didn't feel like a chasm. It felt like the first step toward healing. Finally, Cole took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I don't know if I can just forget everything that's happened, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to work through this. If you really mean it." Ethan nodded, his eyes filling with gratitude. "I do mean it, Cole. I want to rebuild what we've lost." And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the possibility of a future. One where the distance between them didn't feel so wide, where the pain didn't feel so deep. But it would take time. It would take effort. And it would take trust, something they both had to earn. The air in the office felt thick, oppressive as Ethan stared at the phone in his hand. It had been days since his last conversation with Cole. Things had been different since their confrontation. It had been the first real conversation they'd had in months, maybe years, and now there was a palpable shift in the air between them. Ethan had apologized, laid bare his fears, and admitted his mistakes, but the distance between them still felt vast. It wasn't going to be easy, and Ethan knew it, but he had to prove something to Cole, to himself. The call he had just made to Victor had solidified his resolve. The tension that had built up over the past few months, the games, the silence, it was all leading to this moment. Ethan couldn't keep running from the truth. He needed to know if Cole's loyalty was still intact, if the bond they had could survive all the damage that had been done. And to do that, Ethan had to take the risk. Cole's voice on the phone, shaky and distant, echoed in his mind as he sat back in his chair. He had heard the weariness, the hesitation, the unsaid words. The trust wasn't fully there yet, not completely. It was too fragile to be considered whole. But Ethan knew what he had to do next. He stood up, pacing back and forth in the quiet room. He had one final test in mind, one that would prove just how far they had come or whether they were destined to remain fractured forever. Victor had mentioned the rival company that had been circling Ethan's empire. They had been eyeing his business for months now, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Ethan had made a calculated move to counter their interest, but there was still an opening, a weak point in the armor. He could expose that weakness, take the business deal with the rival company, and guarantee his empire's survival. But it would come at a cost. It would be a betrayal, plain and simple, not just of Cole, but of everything Ethan had sworn to protect. And Cole would be the first to feel the sting of it. He couldn't bring himself to be that person again, the one who always put business above everything else. He had already been there, already hurt his brother in ways that would take years to undo. But the temptation was overwhelming. A knock on the door snapped him from his thoughts. "Come in," Ethan said, his voice tight, his stomach churning. Cole stepped into the office, his eyes cautious. The last few days had been quiet between them, an uneasy truce that neither of them had fully embraced. Ethan could see it in Cole's posture. He was still unsure, still questioning whether this whole thing could ever truly be repaired. "Ethan," Cole said, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying the tension that lingered. "We need to talk." Ethan took a deep breath, stepping forward. "Yeah, we do." Cole paused, looking at him with an intensity that was hard to meet. "I've been thinking about everything, about what you've said, about what's been happening." Ethan nodded. He knew what was coming. It had been too quiet between them for too long. The moment of truth was here, and it would be up to him to make the call. "I know I hurt you," Ethan began, his voice low. "I know I made mistakes, and I'm sorry for all of it. But I need you to understand something, Cole." Cole's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms. "What is it?" "I've been facing something that I didn't want to admit, something I didn't want you to know about. The business, there's a deal on the table. A huge one," Ethan said, his voice thick with the weight of what he was about to reveal. "I'm being offered a way to solidify everything, to make sure we don't lose it all." Cole raised an eyebrow. "What kind of deal?" "It's with a rival company. They've been circling us for months, and they see a weakness in our defenses. If I take this deal, everything will be fine. The business will be safe, but it comes at a cost." Cole's expression darkened. "What kind of cost?" "I'll have to sell out parts of the company. I'll have to betray the vision we've worked for," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with guilt. "I'll have to make a choice between keeping everything we have and losing a piece of what matters most." Cole took a long, slow breath. "And you're asking me what?" "I'm asking you to trust me," Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice softer now. "I don't want to lose everything we've built, but I don't want to lose you either." Cole was quiet for a long time. Ethan could see the struggle in his eyes, the anger, the hurt, the love, all tangled up in one look. It was a test, the final test. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Ethan," Cole said quietly. "Not after everything, but if you really want to rebuild, then this is your chance. But don't make me part of your game anymore. Don't make me choose between you and the business again." Ethan's heart sank. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and waiting for. Cole was testing him back. "I won't, Cole, I promise," Ethan said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm done with the games. I just need you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to fix it." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a step forward. Cole nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. "Let's see if you can keep that promise," Cole said, turning toward the door. "But don't expect it to be easy. I'll be watching." As the door clicked shut behind him, Ethan stood alone in the silence, feeling the weight of his brother's words. The test had begun, and Ethan knew there was no turning back. Ethan sat on the couch, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve, the room eerily quiet except for the sound of Cole moving around the kitchen. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. They had both agreed to try, to rebuild what had been broken between them, but the path ahead felt uncertain. The weight of their history loomed over them, each of them carrying pieces of the past they weren't sure how to fix. Cole walked back into the room with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down in front of Ethan before sitting down across from him. There was a tiredness in his eyes, a weariness that came from years of keeping up appearances, pretending that everything was fine when it never really was. Ethan noticed it now more than ever, the cracks, and for the first time, he didn't want to pretend anymore. Cole took a sip of his coffee and sighed, staring into the mug as if it could provide him with answers. "You've been quiet," he said, not looking up. "What's going on?" Ethan shifted in his seat, the truth weighing heavily on his chest. He hadn't felt this exposed in years. "I'm not sure how to start," he admitted. His voice was rough, raw from all the unspoken words they had left between them. "I've spent so long building walls around myself, around everything. But now that I'm sitting here, I don't know how to start tearing them down." Cole raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady, waiting. "You start by being honest, with yourself, with me." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had spent so long avoiding the truth, running from it, but Cole was right. This was the only way forward. Slowly, he took a deep breath and let the words come. "I've been afraid, Cole. I've been afraid of losing you, afraid of failing, and it's made me do things I regret. I thought if I tested you, if I saw how loyal you were, it would prove something to me. But it didn't prove anything. It only showed me how much I've taken you for granted. I've treated you like an afterthought. I've hurt you, and I can't undo that." There was a long silence, the kind that stretched between them, almost unbearable. Ethan felt the sting of his own words, the weight of the confession, but he didn't look away from Cole. He couldn't. This was the reckoning. Cole's expression remained neutral, unreadable, but Ethan could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his coffee cup tightly. Finally, Cole spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Ethan, I've been carrying so much for so long, not just for you, for everyone, for the family, for Dad, and I've always felt like I was second, like I was never enough. Even when you said you trusted me, even when you said we were a team, it never felt real. Not until now." Ethan's heart ached as the words sank in. He had no idea how much Cole had been carrying alone, how much he had hidden from him in an effort to protect his family, to protect Ethan. The realization that Cole had been suffering quietly in the background hit him harder than any test could have. "I'm sorry, Cole," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't see it. I didn't see how much you were carrying, how much you were trying to do on your own. I thought you could handle it. I thought I was helping, but I wasn't. I've been blind to everything you've been through." Cole looked at him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I know you were trying to protect me, trying to protect the business, but you didn't have to do it this way. You didn't have to shut me out. You didn't have to make me feel like I wasn't worth your trust." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his brother's words. This wasn't just about business, about loyalty. This was about something deeper, about the connection they had lost along the way. The realization stung, but it also brought clarity. "I know," Ethan said quietly, "and I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Not yet. I don't expect it to be easy, and I'm not going to pretend that it will be. But I want to rebuild this. I want to rebuild us, Cole. If you're willing to try." The words hung between them, fragile, vulnerable. Cole didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Then slowly, Cole set the mug down and stood up. I'm not going to pretend like everything's fine, and I'm not going to forget everything that's happened. But I'm willing to try too. I'm willing to see if we can get back to where we were. Ethan felt a rush of relief flood through him, a sense of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. There would be days when the wounds would feel fresh again, days when they would fall back into old patterns. But for the first time in a long while, he believed that they could heal. As Cole turned to walk away, Ethan called out softly, "Thank you, Cole, for this, for giving us a chance." Cole didn't turn around, but Ethan could see the slightest flicker of a smile on his face, a gesture small but meaningful. "We'll see, Ethan. We'll see." And with that, Cole walked out, leaving Ethan alone in the quiet of the room. But for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like the beginning of something new. What do you think of Ethan's actions? Was his decision to test his brother's loyalty justified, or did he go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments below. From 0 to 10, what's your score on how this story unfolds? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our stories. Also, make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.